I didn't know it was in the morning. I thought you do that. Oh, okay. Calm down.
Okay. Good evening. Good evening. Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
How's everybody with this cold weather?
Cold.
Cold, yes. We're going to have a really nice talk with Dr. Chad Husby on his most recent explorations in the Spice Islands. And then we have a really good flower table today that Adam, our new vice president, is going to present. And I'm the new president, by the way. I'm Jessica, if you guys don't know me. We do have calendars today for sale. It's a fundraiser. They're only $15. And if you say, oh, 15's a lot, it's not. It's really not, because I checked on Amazon, and most calendars are $12 to $20. It's all photographs taken by our members, submitted original photographs, and of flowering tropical trees. So please take a look when you get a chance. They're in the back, behind Marcia. Our membership, and if you're not a member, sign up, please. It's only $30 a year. Oh, and we are working on our next newsletter. I know it's been a while. I've been a little busy. So we're working on that. We're going to get some articles from different people. And then now to Adam for the flower table.
So the warm weather lately has definitely made a lot of things bloom either way out of season or earlier as extended blooming periods, which is kind of fun though. So there's a lot of stuff like the plumeria that are still blooming in January, which normally would be long deciduous and quiet by now, and then others blooming much earlier than normal. So we're going to go alphabetical because then I can remember what everything is. This year's Aloysia virgata, sweet almond bush, small tree, very fragrant, blooms all year round. Bees love it. Bauhinia bidentata is a Bauhinia vine. It's a climbing, flowering thing. Flowers pretty much all the time in warm weather. Vigorous grower, pretty, again, bees and butterflies like it. This is Bixa Orellana. It's the annatto tree. The flowers, it flowered a couple months ago, and these are the seed pods that start developing. Inside, I don't know what you can see, there's little seeds, and there's a very waxy coating on them. It's very dark red when they're mature, and this is where the natural annatto food coloring comes from. So a lot of cheeses and other foods are colored with that. These two flowers are off a Bombax sabre tree, very, very large tree that grows. Loses its leaves in the dry season and flowers this time of year. These are, I believe, different Brunfelsias. Not sure which species. What is it? Australis, Larry says. Callistemon species, bottle brush. These aren't necessarily tropical, but I have some and they're blooming now. These are camellia flowers, which are more of a temperate species. Usually northern Florida up is where they do better. This is a bunch of various cananga flowers, which is the lang-lang trees, lang-lang family. These are very, very fragrant. The Chanel No. 5 is made from the oil from the flowers of these, but I'll pass these around.
What differentiate
Keep running.
the Kirkii from the...
There's two different species there. This is a canna lily flower. These are Ceiba pentandra flowers, kapok trees. Very, very, very large tree, one of the largest in the rainforest. This is a Clerodendron Java red vine, related to the bleeding heart clerodendrons. Clusia lanceolata, sometimes called the porcelain flower family. There's a white, the flowers are very white and shiny. The whole Clusia group is generally native to the Caribbean, Florida, very salt tolerant, very drought tolerant, no pest problems, good landscaping plant. This is one of the gingers, costus species. These are two different Dumbeas. This flower's not doing so well. This is a Dumbea willikii. The flowers hang down like this. They're much more good looking when they're fresh. The flowers usually only last a few days and then they turn brown easily. These are the Seminole Dumbeas, which is a sterile hybrid These bloom pretty much all winter long. Great landscaping plant, green for the whole summer, spring, and then starting fall they'll bloom. And since they're sterile and don't set seeds, the plant wants to keep pushing more flowers out, so it'll bloom all the time. This is Erythrina herbacea, the native coral bean plant. Euphorbia guinnessea. This is, I forgot the name also. Amazon logo though. Eucharis amazonica. This is a little branch that was blooming off a Gliricidia tree, Gliricidia sepium. This is normally blooming in March or April, but I think the warmer weather triggered this to go. Inzora species. These little purple ones are Jacaranda jasminoides. It's a jacaranda that blooms much, much smaller, much, much younger, and stays smaller generally than normal jacaranda species. It has a much, much darker purple. Heliconia species, not sure which cultivar this is, but these make great cut flowers. You can cut them and they'll stay good looking for a week or two. This is Michelia alba, which is in the Magnolia family, related to the also the Michelia champaca, which is more of an orangish flower, but very, very fragrant. This is the flower off of a macaranga. It's sort of a funny bush thing with giant, large flowers all the time. This is the Brazilian red cloak plant. It's kind of wilty right now, but it's Megascopasma erythroclamus. Blooms in the winter, butterflies, hummingbirds love it. This broke, but this is a balsa tree flower. It's Ochroma pyramidale. It's super, super fast growing tree related to baobabs, floss silks, capox, same family. The flower's kind of weird looking, but they're one of the larger flowers you'll see.
Okay, look at George.
These are two different fire spikes, Odontonema species, purple and red. It's a hummingbird favorite. Most things with the long tubular flowers are ideal for hummingbirds and butterflies in the winter. This is an osmanthus fragrans, sometimes called the tea olive plant. The flowers are very small, but they're very, very fragrant. These are brisket flowers. It's a type of cactus, and it is a true cactus in the Cactaceae family, but it's tropical and it likes water a lot. It's not a typical desert cactus, but these come in several different colors, grow easily, grow fast, low maintenance. This was the plumeria from earlier, Plumeria rubra, one of the cultivars. One of the Portlandia flowers, grandiflora. These are two different pseudobombax species, which are Bombaceae family, the same as baobabs, floss silks, capox. This is Pseudobombax lipticum. This here is Pseudobombax grandiflorum.
They're a bit early too, aren't they?
So the white Pseudobombax lipticum, at least mine, that usually starts blooming December and will bloom nonstop through April.
Oh, wow.
A much better bloomer than the pink ones. The pink ones they bloom really great for I feel like 3 or 4 weeks in March or April, and then they're done.
Yeah.
There's a long period of time where there's no leaves, no flowers in those, whereas the white one is either leaves or flowers. This is a Sirocco species. Declinata. These are two different, these are both Spathodia campanulata, African tulip trees. This is a yellow version, this is the normal red version. These are the flowers off Stemodenia littoralis, Milky Way tree. Very pretty tree, the flowers very fragrant. Moderate growing speed, but very good for someone who has a smaller, medium-sized yard who'd like a nice tree in a somewhat shady location. They do well in shade also. Salt tolerant. These are Strophanthus flowers, fish poison vines, sometimes called climbing oleander. The flowers sort of resemble that. They make a toxic poison that they use to stun fish with it. This is the fruit off of a Schefflera arboricola, typical landscaping Schefflera plant. You can see them at Home Depot all the time, but there are a lot of them fruiting around. If you look, you'll see these hanging out in people's bushes. And these flowers also kind of wilted, but this is Solanum reddii. It's the giant potato tree. It has typical Solanum, which is potato tomato family. And sometimes it'll make these little potato-like things in the tree, but usually not. Fast-growing, flowers all year round. Butterflies like it, bees like it. And that's it for the table.
That's cool.
I think that's very cute. So this is our speaker, Dr. Pat Husby. Most of you know him because he's on our board. He does work here at Fairchild, and he's really, really awesome at plants. And he goes on these really awesome trips that I'm super envious. So watch all the pictures; they're beautiful.
Thank you all for coming tonight. We're excited to be able to share with you a great adventure we had in far east of Indonesia, retracing the path that David Fairchild trod about 76 years ago. And so just to give you an idea of where we were, this is Southeast Asia, so it's about as far away from South Florida as you can get on the globe without being in the water. So places, this whole part is Indonesia here, there's Malaysia, Thailand, all those, that whole part of the world. It's extremely rich in plants, and it's one of the places that David Fairchild was most fascinated with for finding new plants. And so our adventure, and to preface this a little bit, there are about 6 of the people who accompanied me on this trip here, so if I say anything wrong, I expect rapid corrections. And so we were in Indonesia. We started out in Jakarta, the capital, and visited a couple of botanic gardens, and then we went over to this part, which is called the Spice Islands, and we began our adventure. So this was the Fairchild representation of the trip. So Dr. Carl Lewis, the director, Jason Lopez, who's the living collections manager, there's myself, and Dr. Brett Jestro, and I'd like to acknowledge very important support during this. Dr. Lynn Lohe made it possible for the 3 of us to join this adventure. I'd like to thank you for that wonderful opportunity. And so we started out on the island of Java in the Bogor Botanic Garden, one of the world's great botanic gardens. And it was a real thrill to be here because I'd heard many stories about this row of these giant agathis, these giant tropical conifers, and there they were, right in that garden. And so this was our group. By the time we were all assembled, there were 20 of us. Many of us were Fairchild volunteers, Fairchild staff, and other friends who came along. And this is the beautiful bark of those agathis trees. David Fairchild really loved them because they look like Grecian columns. Some of the other magnificent trees we saw around the garden. They have great glass houses in Bogor. It's a fantastic botanic garden. It was started by the Dutch when Indonesia was still a Dutch colony. They still have a lot of the old Dutch architecture in their laboratory buildings. And they have some of these incredible old trees. David and Marion Fairchild actually photographed themselves in front of this pair of trees back in the 20s, I believe. And they have trees that have fantastic root systems, like these figs, all around the garden.
What is that?
That's a terminalia of some kind. And so we explored the garden for an afternoon after we'd all arrived, and then had a nice dinner in the garden to begin our trip. And one thing nobody did on this trip is starve. We had wonderful food the whole way, and it was, Southeast Asia, the food is so much more diverse than what we're used to here. So many more vegetables and fruits, and other creatures too sometimes. We next visited the Chibodas Botanic Gardens, which is the other big old colonial garden on the island of Java. This was visited also by David Fairchild, not on his the expedition we were commemorating, but on earlier expeditions. And it also had the beautiful Dutch buildings and some really beautiful heirloom aloe trees and lots of other things. They were really pleased to have us visiting. They even requisitioned this special little buggy to take us around up and down the hills of the garden, which this garden is, so Bogor, the first garden we were at, was in the lowlands. It's in the hot, humid lowlands of Indonesia, whereas the Chibodas garden was made in the highlands up on a mountain in order to be able to grow cooler growing plants. So it's really steep terrain getting around, but it's a gorgeous garden, and it's a couple of 100 acres. It's quite large, lots of beautiful ponds. We've got waterfalls and streams, and lots of people vacation there. This was groups of girls and boys from school who were having an afternoon in the garden and really enjoying it. They've got a beautiful fern garden, and even some wonderful flowering trees like this Dillenia philippinensis. And a really special tree that I'd been wanting to see for a long time, and I'd heard about from a colleague in Germany who studies this as a tropical conifer from Fiji that's very, very rare, and they've got this over century-old specimen here, and it was amazing to be able to look at it in person finally. And we got a chance to get started with some of the magnificent palms we were going to see on this trip, because one of David Fairchild's very favorite palm is a Pigafetta phalaris. And so we had a couple of specimens here. That's Dr. Brett Jestro at the bottom there, to give you an idea of how incredibly tall these palms are. And David Fairchild just loved these palms, and first discovered them when he was visiting this part of the world. And yeah, these are a couple of the trunks of these agathis trees, these tropical conifers, that David Fairchild loved because he loved columns. He loved the columnar shape of their stems. So you can see how they don't taper much. They just stay very cylindrical all the way up. So I always like to take pictures next to them when they're around. And it was interesting because David Fairchild actually planted one of these, I think it was in the 40s, at the Kampong. And his friend said, well, why did you plant this tree then? Because you're not going to be able to see it take on the characteristics that you love so much, namely these huge cylindrical soaring trunks. And he said, the plants are like children. They're wonderful from all the way from the beginning all the way to adulthood. So I thought that's a good perspective on plants. You don't need to see them in their full development to appreciate them. Chibodas Botanic Garden became famous recently because it had what's probably the world's largest Amorphophallus titanum flowering there. It's so they keep them very well secured there behind bars. Fairchild used to bloom them here. Many of you may remember Mr. Stinky. So these made Mr. Stinky look pretty small by comparison. These were pretty enormous. The one that flowered there a year ago, apparently, which produced this stalk of seeds there, was apparently almost 10 feet tall and flowered. So that's amazing. And they were very carefully collecting the seeds of the garden, and they were cleaning them each individually, weighing them each individually, and recording the weights, so they had the seeds all lined up there. So they were really taking care of this world record holding event that they had. So this was kind of the prelude to the main event here, which was to explore the Spice Islands. And this is the area of Indonesia called Maluku, and it was called the Spice Islands because back several centuries ago, 500 starting about when the Portuguese and the Dutch got there about 500 years ago until even right into the 19th century, this was the only area of the world where nutmeg was grown, where mace was grown, and so it was really important. And those spices were worth their weight in gold, literally, back then. And also nutmeg was the other famous one. So nutmeg and mace come from one tree, and cloves come from another tree. So this whole area was eventually, the different European powers fought over it because it was so valuable, and eventually it came into the hands of the Dutch, and it was a Dutch colony for several hundred years until Indonesia gained its independence after World War II. And so David Fairchild went to these islands to explore them in 1939, 1940, and his trip was cut a bit short, and at the end of it, he made this observation that, he was wondering what the future held for this part of the world, which back then he saw what a wonderful paradise it is. But he could see that the world was changing. Air travel was becoming more prominent. Roads were being built. It was being developed quickly, and he was wondering what's going to happen in the future. And so part of this trip was to compare what we see today with what we saw then and see what the modern world has wrought in this part of the world. So Fairchild's whole trip was pretty extensive, all the way from the North Philippines down to Java, where we were, and with lots of stops in between. And it took about 9 months, mostly in 1940. It was cut short because the Germans invaded the Netherlands, which this was a Netherlands colony at that time, so it was at that time called the Dutch East Indies. And that put the Netherlands colonies into a state of emergency. The Japanese had not yet begun moving this way. That didn't happen for another year, but because of the instability due to the Netherlands invasion by Germany, Fairchild and his crew were told to leave, but they weren't told to leave like in a big hurry, so they added some stops on their way. So we basically retraced this, the part of their trip that focused on the Spice Islands, that was this leisurely exit from the Dutch East Indies in 1940. And so they made it as leisurely as possible because didn't want to lose any of the opportunity to be there. So this is once again this part of the world where we were. And so it takes about, to give you some perspective, it takes about 24 hours of travel time to get to Jakarta from here. To include layovers, there's no direct flights, so our flight had one layover and it was about 24 hours if you totaled up everything. And then it's another 3 hours flight to get to the Moluccas, to get to the Spice Islands. So it's quite a bit of traveling to get to this part of the world. And you're actually in the same time zone as Tokyo. So it's about 15 hours ahead of us. So you're literally living in the future when you do this. And so we started on the end of September in the island of Ambon, which is famous for its being basically the capital of the Spice Islands region and the biggest settlement in this region. And then we went to quite a few more islands. So we did about 12 islands in about 11 days. We started with this famous monument of the great botanist Rumphius, who was a Dutch ethnobotanist who wrote this incredible compendium of the herbal uses of plants in Indonesia back in the 17th century. And so David Fairchild also posed next to this monument. This isn't the same monument because the Second World War destroyed the first one, but it's very close to it. And we got a chance to look at some of the early prints of his book, the Ambonese Herbal. So Rumphius was stationed here and even finished this writing while blind. He went blind later in life, and his first manuscript was lost at sea, and he had to start over again. And he still finished it, and it's still this monumental work. And so great testimony to dedication. We then, our first little field trip into nature was to visit a place called Soya, which David Fairchild visited. It's kind of a mixed area where they planted some agricultural trees in the old days. We got a chance to see a lot of interesting ferns along the way, or at least I saw ferns. And other people were looking at other plants, because that's one of these, on these trips you notice that people, when you have a diverse group of people, exploring these regions of the world, different people are interested in different things. So if you hear other people giving talks on this trip, don't be afraid to go, because they'll probably be quite a bit different. And so we also saw one of these. This is an older specimen of one of those agathis trees that David Fairchild liked so much, when the bark starts to get rougher. But you can see that one of its ethnobotanical uses, one of its human uses, is the sap, the resin that they use for caulking in ships, and it's also used as kind of an incense sometimes. So it was neat to see that they were bleeding the tree for that resin there. So then we got on our boat, the Ombak Putih, which is a wonderful vessel. It was very stable. We each had cabins, most of us shared cabins below deck, and we sailed off into the sunset. So the first place we visited actually was to go snorkeling. One of the neat additions to all the botanical parts of this trip was the exploration of the incredible coral reefs in this part of the world. And each night we had lectures. So it was Dr. Carl Lewis giving the first lecture. So it was a little bit of school in addition to adventure. And so he largely gave us context into where our trip fit into David Fairchild's itinerary, as well as the interesting botanical discoveries that had been made. So our first full day, we got into these little zodiacs. So these were how we get on and off the ship. The ship was big enough we didn't get that close to shore. So I want to show you a little video of what zodiac travel was like. So a little bit of the Jacques Cousteau feel. What we would do several times a day. And that's the ship. And so our cabins were below there, where those portholes are. It was a very stable ship, so nobody had any serious seasickness, it's fortunate. So it was really useful to have this kind of transportation in this part of the world, because a lot of these places we went to, you can't get to them any other way than by boat, just like back in 1940. So it was very, very useful to have this. And so this is our first landing. It was a bit wet. They would warn us before we got ready for each disembarking that whether it was a wet landing or a dry landing. And so our first landing was really wet and muddy. So you wear your shoes accordingly. And it was also raining. So when you're in the field, sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate. That's our ship in the distance there. And so this was a little village that David Fairchild visited in 1940, where he observed the making of sago, which is a traditional starch that is part of this part of the world. And so this was, you can see how much it was raining, so we had to wait a little bit for the rain to pass. And a little interesting dimension of our trip was that one of the people who went along with us, Jill Menzel, she has a company that manufactures soccer equipment in Brazil, and so when she goes on expeditions, she likes to bring equipment for the children in these remote areas who often won't have access to lots of the fancy modern soccer equipment and uniforms and whatnot. So each of these villages we went to, we would drop off equipment for the children and the teachers. And they were very happy about that generally. And I was greeted by lots of lovely children in most places where we were. And here they sang us several songs, and they had quite strong voices. And so this is a picture of David Fairchild took when one of his crew took of the making of sago. This is a starch that they make from a palm called metroxylon, and so they grind up the stems and they dissolve the starch in water, and then it comes out and it congeals, and then they bake it, and it's something they eat as a starch. And fascinatingly enough, so here we are 76 years later, and things look pretty much the same. So here they are making sago. The equipment looked identical, and the economy of this little village, without the satellite dishes, was pretty much. So there's a river there, and they're pouring the water in and leaching out the starch.
They're just diluting the starch, right? They're just washing it.
And what happens, you get this. They said it smells like cheese. I didn't actually get a chance to smell it. And then, a chance to see them.
If I take and I press, it becomes the same that we have seen the starch that precipitate on when they wash the sack. So they just take this from those spots, they just take that.
bake
These clay pots, let's call it, now they are very.
So it was very, very authentic, and it's one of the several places we visited that it was amazing, that looked just like it probably looked during David Fairchild's time, with the satellite dish here and there, but otherwise pretty much the same. And one of the things we were treated with is spectacular sunsets and sunrises all the way along. It's an incredibly beautiful part of the world, and a real joy to be on ships to see it too. It's nothing like a sunset from on board a ship. So we then went to another island, Buru Island, and visited a beach, the very same beach that David Fairchild and his team visited, and they had collected some plants back then. One of which was at Fairchild until very recently. A storm took it out a couple of years ago. But yeah, it was amazing how similar it was. As you can see, even the tree looks fairly similar. It's the same kind of tree, and that's our whole group there. And
Thanks.
that's our ship in the background there.
That's fun.
And after that, we went to an island that was mainly for looking at some of the interesting sea creatures, especially mud skippers, which are these fascinating little fish that I'm very fond of. But we also were able to do some botanizing along the beach, and this is a pretty fascinating plant. It's a Discidia, and it's a plant that actually has a symbiotic relationship with ants. So ants live under these cup-shaped leaves and protect it and fertilize it. And we did see a really wonderful flowering tree. This is a really neat mangrove from this part of the world, Limnitzer littoralis, and there were all kinds of parrots that were visiting the flowers up there, small parrots. And this was some of the scenery with the beautiful mangrove roots there.
Mud skippers.
Mud skippers.
Oh, there he is.
They're these little amphibious fish, so they can breathe underwater or on land, and they do skip around. And they're quite charming. They're like a little combination between a frog and a fish, and so I'll show you a little video of how they move. So this was just me walking through. And so just watch for little things moving. See, they'll jump up on the log. You can see the things. They're not your typical fish because they can jump out of the water.
They're so cool.
And jump back into the water if they want. So, and then boats again there, and so after snorkeling and looking at mud skippers and beach vegetation, we headed to Obi Island, and this was an island, this is the big one here. We were just at the beach up here. I was hoping to see some rare tropical conifers, so I was busy pointing out where we might want to go, but we weren't able to go to that part, unfortunately. But we did see some very interesting forests there, and although a lot of it had been logged, so there's a lot of logging pressure on some of these islands, but we did see some wonderful things. This is some sort of plant in the coffee family, Rubiaceae, with these spectacular new leaves. So hoping to find out more about that and see if we can get it into cultivation. I should mention that we weren't able to do collecting on this trip because Indonesia is very strict. They made it very difficult to collect plants and take them out, although I did collect a lot of plants in Singapore afterwards and Malaysia to make up for the gap there. Make sure we kept up with the Fairchild tradition. And then we headed to Mandioli Island, another village that David Fairchild visited there. And this was the view from the village of these islands with the clouds over them, these volcanic islands all over the place. Incredibly beautiful. And you can see the village, a little goat there. This probably doesn't look too much different than it did back during Fairchild's day. Still very traditional. Many of the villages would have just a single cycad growing there. And as before, we handed out soccer equipment, and this was one of our boat boatmates, Victor Fazano from Brazil, and he's about 6'4", so he was literally taller than everyone we saw on the whole trip. So he was a bit of a star, and he's got a very deep voice, so he would tell the children, like, you can be the goalie, and you can be. So he was a big hit for them. So, and this was our group exploring the village. It was a big event. Some of these villages, I think this one they hadn't really had outsiders visit in several years. So we were the first people they had. And so it was a big event, and everybody was enjoying following us. And these are the Spice Islands. And so they had this was actually some cacao, some mace, and nutmeg and other places. They had all kinds of spices out drying everywhere, just like they would have long ago. See, they've got their laundry out there. And interesting too, this is something that we recognize from this part of the world, they're crotons.
Yeah.
And crotons are actually from Indonesia originally. And so they're actually an interesting part of their culture there. You find it's probably the most common garden plant we saw, other than the food plants like the coconut palms and stuff like that. But it's interesting that they mention that one of the symbolic uses of it is that if you're invited to a party and you're not home, if one of your neighbors comes to invite you, they'll leave a croton leaf as a symbol that you're still invited. So that's kind of neat to see. And they're giving rides. And another person who was kind of famous just by their appearance is Jason. His beard was a real phenomenon. So he had many requests for selfies. There were other people who wanted to, feel his beard. So he's a star in Indonesia. And so when we got back to the boat after visiting the village and whatnot, we had some visitors from the village, and it wasn't the boys who came. It was the girls who got in one of their ships, one of the little dugout canoes, and came out to visit our ship there. So that was pretty fun. And we had concerts a couple nights on board, where they sang and danced a bit of traditional Indonesian music. And from that island, we went to a bigger island, Bachan Island. And this island was also... So one of the things that inspired David Fairchild to want to go to the Spice Islands was that one of his great heroes, Alfred Russel Wallace, had gone and spent a lot of time here. Alfred Russel Wallace is a great 19th century English explorer, famous for having co-discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection along with Charles Darwin, and also his incredible natural history observations and collections throughout South America and Indonesia, Malaysia, this whole part of the world. And so he had spent about 5 months on Bachan Island, so that's one of the reasons why Fairchild was also interested to go. And so we actually were able to do a really wonderful forest hike here along a river bed that was mostly dry. And found a lot of, this was a relative of nutmeg here, a myristica tree, which is a beautiful fruit. This is a musayenda, which is in the coffee relative, beautiful flowering tree to see in the wild there. And we saw a plant that I was really fascinated to see for the first time. This is Dr. Brett Jestro, along with this right here. When you look at it, you might think it is what? What does it look like? A branch, maybe? Coffee. Yeah, not specifically what kind of plant, but it's just what part. It's actually, this is actually, the entire thing is one leaf. And it's one of only 2 genera of trees that actually have leaves that keep growing continually over time. They don't just grow to a predetermined size and stop. We have one genus in the New World, Guarea, and this is the Old World genus, Chrysocheton, which Dr. Jack Fisher, who was a botanist here at Fairchild for many years, had studied, and I'd heard of it but hadn't seen it, so Brett noticed this there, and it's quite fascinating because if you look at the end of a leaf, it has this little growth tip that's producing new pairs of leaflets, and it will do that continuously until it gets damaged on the end, so that was pretty exciting to see. And these giant leaves actually function like branches. They get woody, they get thicker, you can graft them, but they actually are leaves. And there was spectacular fungi. It's, you know, you go into the tropics and you see all kinds of wonderful things. And we also saw another of these amazingly tall and elegant pigafetta palms. And it was good to, we stopped wherever we saw them and took pictures because David Fairchild had driven his crew crazy telling them to keep taking pictures of this palm because it's so beautiful. So we thought we'd follow that tradition. And we then did some sightseeing in the village. We visited this old Dutch fort here, which still had a moat around it. And saw this is a neat pandanus with red fruits there. And lots of charming children, as always. And yes, I want to mention that one of the neat things that about the modern technology is that, you know, often what they, you know, they were very happy to have their pictures taken, but they wanted to see them, what they look like. And so the fact that we have digital cameras and can show them instantly, you can see the reaction. That was a big hit. And while we were there, we visited the, they have sultans, local kings in this part of the world, in both Indonesia and Malaysia. And so the Sultan of Bacan Island, this was his palace, and we had a talk by some folks who are knowledgeable about his reign and legacy, but it turns out he wasn't there. The Sultan himself wasn't there. He was in a place you really wouldn't expect. He was in Ohio. So supposedly working as an investor in Ohio, and so yeah, we're not really sure. So you know, wondering when Ohio will become a sultanate. It's going to be a state. So we also had a chance to visit the market in Bacan, which is full of incredible diversity of food and crafts. We had various, some of this was with the sago, and some of it was cassava, and all kinds of vegetables and fruits. A huge market, all kinds of beautiful fresh foods. And probably this made up some of our meal later on the trip. And beautiful fish. The fish were actually some of the most photogenic parts of it. Yeah. Because the oceans here are extremely productive and extremely rich and still in pretty good shape. All kinds of fascinating creatures. We later visited an old Dutch plantation of the giant rubber trees, the rubber figs, Ficus elastica, that were quite magnificent. And it was right across from a military installation there, so the kids were getting ready. And this was one of the taxi methods there, which was also the case in David Fairchild's times. And once again, these beautiful sunsets along the coast there. And this was just taken returning to the ship that evening. And just before I leave Bacan, I love this quote from Alfred Russel Wallace. He wrote in his famous book, The Malay Archipelago, about a butterfly. He discovered a bird of paradise, a new bird of paradise there, and he discovered a new butterfly, he discovered lots of things, a lot of beetles. He said the beauty and brilliancy of this insect, which is actually a bird-winged butterfly, a new one that he'd seen, are indescribable, and none but a naturalist can understand the intense excitement I experienced. When I at length captured it, on taking it out of my net and opening the glorious wings, my heart began to beat violently. The blood rushed to my head, and I felt much more like fainting than I have done when in apprehension of immediate death. I had a headache the rest of the day, so great was the excitement produced by what will appear to most people a very inadequate cause. So that's just a sense of the fascination of exploring nature that motivated people like Fairchild and Wallace and us today. So this is, our next stop was to visit a river that David Fairchild had explored, and this was a river that he was looking at because Wallace had explored. Wallace had been looking mainly for animals when he was there. And he had been disappointed by this river, Alfred Russel Wallace had been, because it was too thick with vegetation. So that made Fairchild think that, well, maybe that was a river worth visiting. So they did, and so we did too, so that was our ship anchored offshore. And we went out in our inflatable Zodiacs to explore the river. And Victor, being more adventurous, went in the dugout canoe. And we saw they were making sago along the way, just like before, and we saw there were some interesting lizards, some dragons along the river, and some nice vegetation. We never got out along the river, so this was all things we saw from the boats. Some interesting aeroids. These fascinating spike-like mangrove roots that came up from below. I never figured out what they were from exactly. I like that. Wow. And this is the Nipa palm, the world's only mangrove palm, so it makes these big clusters of fruit. And then this is the mouth of the river as we're heading back out. One rediscovery that was quite gratifying was this Bikia. It's related to Portlandias, some Cubanolas, some of the coffee family plants that we grow here. And David Fairchild had collected it there in 1940, and we saw it again in a couple of places. And then we did some snorkeling around this little island here, which was amazing. There were 4 species of lionfish. I didn't have an underwater camera. Jason did, so you should invite him to give a speech about that dimension of the trip, because you could give a whole talk about that, and about other parts of the land trip. And so once again, these incredible sunsets. And then this was fascinating. Yeah, one night, the ship had lights off to the side, and there were all these flying fish started congregating and jumping out of the water, and then they would sometimes just drift by with their wings outstretched. So I managed to catch one and film it. And the rainbow, in the distance there. And so from here we headed north, which ended up meaning we were crossing the equator to our next stop. And everybody was really interested in something here, and it turns out we were looking at dolphins. We ended up amidst a big school of dolphins. There apparently some sort of fish was schooling there, and they were spinner dolphins, so they were jumping out of the water and backflipping and doing all kinds of things. And then there were also a bunch of frigate birds, and you can see down below the dolphins also, and they were all diving. So I think there were